Welcome to the Today Counts show. Today does count because it impacts, it influences your tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. The Today Counts podcast is sponsored by the generous donors of the Lead Today community. I am your host, Tim Piper. All right, guys, so here's the deal. One of my colleagues presented something not too long ago called the core competencies of a high-capacity leader. Core competencies of a high-capacity leader. And, you know, we do a lot of writing at Lead Today and at Piper Management Group. We do a lot of designing, a lot of research, a lot of studying. Obviously, we work with companies that are into the billions, as well as entrepreneurs and everything in between. And one of the things that we have noticed is that leadership is leadership. And one of the things that we try to differentiate in the beginning anyway is when we talk about leadership, we talk about it as a practice. We talk about it as a discipline. We don't talk about it as a person. So in other words, we don't say, you know, she's a good leader, she's a bad leader. Now, someday, someone may just simply say, man, she's a really good leader, meaning that it's kind of like baseball. Kid plays baseball, but we don't call a kid a baseball player. He's in Little League. But if he ever does make the pros, then that's usually when we call him a baseball player, right? So we give ourselves a break. We give ourselves some mercy, and we put ourselves in a posture of learning and of growing and of practicing leadership better. So I have some very strong views on leadership and leaders, but I also have a lot of empathy. I'm a huge cheerleader for people that are sticking their neck out, trying to serve others. That's how I view leadership. And so I think it takes a lot out of us. So this topic today, core competencies of a high capacity leader, I cannot think of any context where it would not apply. So there's 6 big things that I want to share with you guys. The first one has to do with communication. And the way it's stated is clear and consistent communication. I want to talk about 2 sides of communication. I want to talk about a leader's responsibility in communication, and then all of our responsibility, regardless of whether we're a leader or whether we're a team member. And we usually sit in any of those chairs, right? And in leadership philosophy, there's terms that we use: first chair, second chair. It comes from the old orchestras. You know, you got first fiddle, second fiddle. You've maybe heard that term. For probably everybody who calls themselves a human being, you probably somewhere in life sit in the first chair, meaning you're the boss. And probably somewhere, no matter if you're the first chair, somewhere in another part of your life, you are a second chair. There's no third chair, fourth chair, fifth chair. Those is just an analogy of, you know, I'm the one that's leading this cause, or I'm the one who is helping the leader lead this cause. And in that sense, I'm leading from the second chair. So when we talk about leadership, it's kind of important to think about, how do the things that I'm going to share with you fit for you? Are you thinking these principles from a first chair position? Are you thinking them from a second chair position? Or is there a difference? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Are you guys with me so far? All right. I know I've dived into the deep end right away, but let's go ahead and talk about the 2 sides of communication. First, let's talk about what everybody, to be a high performer, regardless of one's role, needs to think about. And it's really something that our organization needs to, I'm going to call it, bring it in the law, make it a law, okay? And I was kind of reaching for some analogies just off the top of my head. If you're a mom or a dad, you know, and you say the same thing to your kid the same way over and over again, right? Do they listen? They don't listen. Right? I've got 7 grandkids and 4 kids, and yeah, it's like parenting. Parenting is a great example of first chair, second chair, and sometimes being stepped on. It's just a good way to look at it. But let's talk about how we communicate first towards one another. Texting, emails, and in person. So let's do some really boring housekeeping first. I think that your organization needs to come up with some laws. I'll give you some examples. In most of the organizations I work with, and because technology constantly evolves, it means that we have to change and adapt. We can't let it happen to us. We need to use the tools and use them effectively and efficiently, right? So I'm just going to give you an example. In my organization, if I text you, it's considered urgent. Now, urgent may not mean, flashing lights, somebody's dying, but it means I might be creating a report right now and I need that information now, or, whatever it might be. If you decide to use texting or an app that's very similar, there's different apps that you can get where the team just uses that app to communicate with one another. I'm sure you guys are familiar with some of those. So whether you use actual texting or whether you use one of those apps that kind of replaces texting, because you get a little notification, when it comes in, you need to come up with what are the standards for responding. For us, if we get a text, we have no less than 1 hour to respond to that text. That usually gives somebody enough time to step out if they're also involved in something important. But you guys need to decide what that is for you. Okay? So some of this is pretty simple, but we all have to buy into it and we have to teach it. Because if it's true for us, then it's going to be true at least through some level in the organization. Let's talk about emails. For us, emails is a little slower, mode of communication, but we still put a 24-hour in our organization. We are to respond within 24 hours. Again, you guys can decide your own. We also have some rules about emails and text, frankly. So back in the day when email was a new thing, I was leading a large organization in Denver at the time, and email was a new thing. So I think that was like 95-ish, 96-ish, something like that. And one thing I noticed about my team is that we really didn't know how to use email. What I mean by that is we knew how to type an email, we knew how to send it, we knew how to receive it and open it, but we didn't really understand the ethics around it and the purpose around it. Again, you guys can decide your own, but one of the rules that I came up with is because as I start seeing these emails come in, some of them were bitch sessions, they were gossiping, they were all kinds of weird stuff going on. So we kind of created some rules. If you mention somebody's name in an email, then they better be CC'd at least on that email. So if you're dealing with a corporate problem, let's say tardiness or a lack of consistency in some way, shape, or form, then speak to that term without speaking about the person. You can speak about that person when you are in person with one another. So for example, once you put something in writing, you better be really careful about what you're putting in writing because it can come back and haunt you. Heck, even things that you say can come back to haunt you. But at least in your leadership meetings, if you're having a problem with a certain employee, and well, then obviously you're going to speak about that employee. You're going to have a conversation. But I would suggest to you that you don't put those kinds of things on text or on emails. It keeps it professional. So think about it. Let's say that you wanted to evaluate this session and one of you thinks that Jim's off. And so what you do is you send an email and you say, yeah, Jim, I don't know where he was, man. And I can understand the thing he said. I think the guy's Lulu. Now, if you knew that you had to CC me on that email, but you had the courage to still give a review, how would you change your words? You would do something that would allow that person the opportunity to participate versus burying them, 6 feet under, right? So these are just some important things. And then in-person communication, you need to kind of think about that too. I like leadership that does this. If Chris dropped the ball and for some reason he's not at the meeting, we know that a ball got dropped. But I would rather ask Chris about that in person in the meeting. So in other words, we could table that issue until Chris is in the meeting and we could say, hey, Chris, we felt like the ball was dropped here. Can we talk about it? Now, let me say something to you about this. This sounds like conflict, right? Conflict is normal. And when you normalize it, it no longer feels bad. In other words, if it becomes part of your culture where you confront things in an appropriate way, a consistent way, you'll find that these big earthquakes that can happen in an organization won't happen to this one. And I've told this story before to some of you, but I'll tell it again real quick. I was looking to take an easy course in college. So obviously I'm going back decades and decades, but I thought geography would be an easy course to take. And of course I was wrong. I think I got a C in it, but um, the instructor, and this was in California, the instructor told us that the plates in California shift, and that's what causes earthquakes. And he says, ideally in California, what you want is you want to have a lot of small shifts. In other words, you want to have earthquakes all the time. Because if you have earthquakes all the time, walls don't crack, glass doesn't break, people don't fall down. It's just a little trimmer. But if you go years without an earthquake, what's scary is the next one may kill people. So if you kind of take that analogy and you make conflict a normal part of our culture, not in the sense of attacking one another or blaming one another or all that junior high stuff, but in the sense of making sure that if you don't understand something, if you disagree with something, if you're trying to get a better understanding of something, it's what we call keep short accounts. Just always be clarifying, always be clarifying. Here's what a leader does when it comes to communication. It's my job to stay aligned with the team. It's my job. So each of us can say that. It's my job to stay aligned with the team. If I don't understand something, if I didn't know something, let's be humble enough to state that and figure that out. Some of this seems like common sense, but in my experience around the nation, it's not so common. There's a lot of stuff. And if you're married and someone comes home and tells you stories about the office or about the workplace, then I rest my case because I just know what goes on, right? Even in our families, we can learn about stuff like this, right? Texting in your family. If you haven't created rules about texting in your family, you probably should. Because if it hasn't created problems yet, it will, right? Because you can't always express what you're trying to say in a text or in an email. So let's use these tools appropriately. I'm not telling you how to do it. I'm just saying you need to define that for yourselves and to do it. All right, now let's talk about something a little more abstract and clear and consistent communication. So that's how we just kind of communicate to one another. But how do leaders communicate? I'm going to give you 3 words. Vision, focus, influence. Vision, focus, influence. It's really important that we as a team are speaking the same language about our vision as an organization. And we do that through a mission statement, and we do that through values. So we need to know the vision so well that we're always talking about the vision so that when we make decisions, they're in line with the vision. The second word, focus, is how you help team members and employees connect what they do to the vision. How do you do that? It says this may not seem very important to you, but when it comes to my eye on leadership, and I walk into a restaurant, I'm looking for clean, right? And the first place I check out clean is the restroom. It's amazing to me how business leaders do not understand how to differentiate themselves from the pack. And it's based on basic human needs. You got little kids, you take a little kid in the restroom, it's gross. Just like if you've done a road trip. If you've done a road trip, everybody holds their breath when they walk into a restroom, right? Am I wrong? And so when you go down Highway 80 and you see Little America billboards, one of the things, at least they used to do, I haven't been down Highway 80 in a long time, but one of the things that caught my eye is that they advertised cleanest restrooms in America. They didn't talk about the soda fountain. They didn't talk about the ice cream cones. They didn't talk about the burgers. They didn't talk about the gas. They didn't talk about the hotel. They didn't talk about all that. They didn't talk about the landscaping, the waterfall. They didn't talk about it. They said clean restrooms. That place was packed. And while you're coming out of the restroom, there's a soda. There's this, there's that, there's other thing. We forget this kind of stuff. This is really, really important. What differentiates us from others? That's what vision and focus is. So vision is the idea where we're going. Focus is helping every employee understand, right? And you let them see the responsibility. You elevate their view of their job. Make sense so far? So vision is where we're going, who we are. focus is how what you do fits into our vision. And then finally, influence is the interpersonal commitment that we all have to love people, to care about people, to treat people well, to know their kids' names, to know what they love and what they hate. That's where influence comes from. All right, so that's a lot. See, I have to go through 6 things and we're already 25 minutes into this. So that's just like an overview that the core competencies of a high capacity leader is we become experts at communication, both ethics, but also with that business mindset. Are we good? Number 2, the second core competency of high capacity leaders is how they manage their time and their energy, or time and energy management. I think one of the things that I have to confess right away is I did not know when I began my journey of leading others, serving others, is that it starts with leading myself. Maybe because I was young and healthy and had plenty of energy, I didn't think about it, right? Because you think you're invincible when you're younger. But then life happens and you start realizing, oh gosh, I actually have to take care of this body. I actually have to take care of this mind. I got to take care of this spirit. I got to take care of me. And it's not a selfish thing. It's a capacity thing. If I think I can work 70 hours a week and 80 hours a week after week after week and be effective, I am sorely wrong. In fact, the best leaders I know have been able to figure out what's important, what's effective, and they work within those human day and night, 7 days a week that God invented, or God created right from the beginning. To work within the engineering of the creator is where we will do better. But when we think we can defy what the creator has made, then we're going to, when's the last time you tried to defy gravity? It's not going to work, right? Don't jump off the building. It's not going to be good, right? So you can't work every day. You can't. You weren't designed to do that. But also, you can't approach your work haphazard. And I don't have time to go into that today, but your temperament has a lot to do with how you should be managing your time, whether you're an introvert, an extrovert, whether you are a planner, whether you are somebody who is better in the moment, whether you are somebody who lives by the 5 senses, or whether you're intuitive and you have the 6th sense. There's a lot of things there. If you haven't taken that temperament assessment, send me an email so I can get it to you and so you can understand yourself there. So time and energy management. There's a lot to say there. We're going to come back to that at another time. Number 3, core competency is intentional, personal, and professional growth. So one of the first questions that Chick-fil-A asks even these young kids that they hire is they said, what book are you reading right now? They ask them, how are you intentionally growing right now? What podcasts are you listening to? What are you studying? How are you getting better as a person? These are interview questions that they ask 16-year-olds. It's interesting. And then, as you probably know, their business model is to see some of those teenagers turn into 20-somethings, get through college, and then become these owner-operators. That is basically their business model. But they know that this learning attitude starts at a young age. So that's a little bit of a hint towards calendar also. How much time are we blocking? And so, let's appreciate what we're doing right now. And I'm throwing terms at you, but what we're doing right now is what I would normally call a quadrant 2 activity. This is extremely important, but it's not urgent. And because it's not urgent, very few people do it. And that's the whole reason why most people live in quadrant 1, which everything is important and everything is urgent. And they live on adrenaline and they end up crashing and burning. Their relationships fall down, their health falls down, their leadership falls down, their productivity falls down, right? You're getting the message from the sermon, right? So intentional, personal, and professional growth. The 4th, and this one, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this one. This one, you guys, is another one of my big mistakes. It's people development. People development. So first of all, you can't develop anybody if you're not developing yourself. How do you suggest a book to somebody if you've never read a book? How do you suggest a podcast to somebody if you've not listened to a podcast? How can you ask other people what they're learning and how they're growing if you can't tell them how you're learning and how you're growing? But to be more exact, there's a huge difference between delegation and empowerment. And that was one of my leadership mistakes as a young man. And even to this day, I have to pay close attention between delegation and empowerment. When we delegate things and we give things to others, generally speaking, it benefits us. We get something off our shoulders and we give it to them. When we empower others, it benefits everybody. So let's talk about the difference between the two. When you empower somebody, you take enough time to onboard them with the task and with the responsibility. A lot of times you show them and you show it to them again, and then you have them do it while you're watching them do it. And then to a point where they understand this is theirs, they own it, and go back to focus. What you do here fits into the vision this way. And I remember the first time this happened to me, I was 16 years old. I was working at Jensen's grocery store in Blue Jay, California, up in the San Bernardino Mountains near Lake Arrowhead. I got my first real big boy job, and besides raking pine needles and, stuff like that as a teenager. And Mike Kelly was my boss, and he had me working in the dairy section there of stocking, ordering. I was learning, facing, I forget what it's called now, but when you make sure that the more dated products are, forward, I forget what that's called, and then I don't know, it was several months later, he brought me out in front of the dairy and he said, "What do you think about this dairy?" And, I'm just a kid, right? I don't know what the heck he's asking me. And so I go, "Well, it's cool." I didn't know what to say. And, then he starts hand feeding me. He goes, "Well, it's a business all to itself." And I go, "Yeah." And it's really important because if you order too much, it spoils and we lose money. And I never even thought about that before. I've done the ordering, but I didn't really think about the consequences of the ordering. Right. And then he talks about the facing and the presentation and keeping the cooler in the back clean. And so he would do that like for 5 minutes. And he did that for a few months. And then one day he said, "Jimmy, this is yours. You own it. You're the boss of it. You're in charge. I now work for you. Anything that I can do to help you be successful, you let me know, because other than that, it's all yours." And I think I went from 16 to 25, in my heart and mind and soul. I took it so seriously. That was a defining moment for me. It helped me understand the difference between delegation and empowerment. Does that help? Does that story help? All right. I think that's a good one. And, really that helps. That helps with turnover too, because, people get bored with what they do, especially if they don't understand the significance of it. If they understand the significance of it, then they'll hang around longer and they'll have more interest in what we're doing. And I think you'll see their ethics improve, as well. So, and we could talk about that all day long, but I think the big idea difference between delegation and empowerment is delegation benefits you, so therefore it doesn't go far enough. Empowerment benefits everybody. Make sense? Phew, okay, we're only halfway through. Oh, no, that's 4. We have 2 more to go. Okay, I've got clear and consistent communication. Number 2, time and energy management. Number 3, intentional personal and professional growth. And number 4, people development. And we talked about the difference between delegation and empowerment. Number 5, high capacity leaders have a high commitment to the enterprise. To say it real simply, you all know that we have folks employed underneath our banner and it's a job. And there's room for people like that. But I would suggest to you that the key word that we're talking about today is leadership. There is no room for anyone on our team who is in a leadership capacity who simply sees it as a job. They have to see it as a steward of a brand, a steward of a reputation, a steward of profit, a steward of the vision, the focus, the influence. They have to see it as a community. They have to see it. What I tell a lot of business owners and business leaders is I said, if you take the time to think about it from the humanities, you're more like a pastor than you are a boss. Boss is just too limiting of a word. It's just not. So when you think about whatever you think about with a pastor or a shepherd of a flock, which the word comes from, right? That whole idea, then what that does is it adds value to your work. Now, the thing we have to remember is that though you are leaders, you're also a sheep. And so when I look at org charts, I have some rules that I'm looking for. One is I don't believe that anyone could work through a group larger than 5 and be effective. In fact, I think really it's difficult. I think 5's a big number. I like 3. But anyway, what I was saying about that is I look at it as a span of care. So, imagine yourself on an org chart and imagine how many boxes are underneath you. The question I ask myself is how much capacity does one person have to appropriately direct people in vision, focus, and influence, right? Because remember what the influence is. That's the caring. That's the interpersonal skill. Focus is helping them see the bigger picture, understanding how their job fits into the bigger picture. That's a lot of work because it's not like how some men, get married and they haven't told their wife that they love them for like 6 months. And that old joke, right? Well, I told her at the altar. Why do I have to tell her again, right? If we know anything about leadership, we know that no, you're not saying it once. You're not saying it 5 times. You're not saying it 50 times. You just keep on saying it. Now you get tired of saying it. But they don't get tired of hearing it. And if they do, they walk out the door and they're not a fit anyway. Having a commitment to the enterprise is, again, it brings me to a biblical idea, a principle. And I think it was one of Jesus' parables. And the conclusion of it was those who are faithful in the smaller things will be faithful in the larger things. And I think every leader and every business owner knows that. When you see somebody who does a really good job at the small things, you really got to pay attention to that person because they have capacity. I'm not saying they have capacity for leadership, but they definitely have capacity for upward mobility, right? And more responsibility. We'll talk about capacity another day because another mistake that we tend to make is we make good performers managers and they hate it and we wonder what went wrong. Not everybody is meant to be a manager. Again, that's not for today. But, once you see some folks and all they want to do is serve tables, make their tips and go home, but that's okay. As long as they live within our values, right? That's okay. But when you're looking for those people that take us to the next level, it's no option. They have to be brand oriented. They have to care about the whole organization and everyone in it. Make sense? And that's how we can be, honest with ourselves. If we lose the love, we need to say it. And we don't want to hurt the organization, right? High capacity leaders, core competency, decisiveness. Anything you put your hands on, everybody on your team is going to take their hands off. Obviously, to expand the organization, you want to start taking your hands off of things so that others will put their hands on them. But as you know, they have to be ready, right? They have to be ready. And you've got to be thinking about that. And how can you do that? How can you test that? Well, for one, you can as a test, take your hands off of something where the risk is small and see what happens. Do they assertively take it and run with it? Or do they say to themselves, that's not my job, or that's not my deal? What do we do typically as leaders, and because we're human beings, when someone doesn't do their job? A lot of times, if we're able, we do it for them. Anybody want to raise their hand to admit that sometimes you've stepped in to do somebody else's job? In the best case scenario, that helps the organization at that moment. This is the best case scenario, but in the long term, it hurts the organization. So we always got to be thinking leadership, not just the task that needs to be done, moving the organization forward. We need to be decisive. The reason why we're not decisive enough, the reason why we don't take on stuff in our personal lives and what is fear of, and then you fill in the blank. Now, there's multitudes types of fear that keeps us from doing. Now, remember what I said. What we want to do is we want conflict, not to be seen as negative. We want it to be a normal part of our culture. And the way we do that is we grow the culture up to being adults. Because we all have inner children. I don't want to become Dr. Phil here, but we all have inner children, I will say, depending upon the topic, the situation, whatever. Some of us are still 14 in some areas. Some of us are 12. Some of us are 18. Some of us are 20, 30, 40. We've grown up in different areas. And sometimes we don't know that until a trigger, so there's some sort of trigger. So when we speak openly the way we are right now, and this becomes part of our culture over time, but it can't be like going to a motivational seminar and then being all better. I mean, I'd go to a motivational seminar and I'd walk out, all on a high, but that only lasts for so long. You know why? Because we all leak. We leak. Vision leaks, values leak, character leaks, it all leaks. And so that's why in our culture, we have to continue to feed ourselves, just like one meal doesn't sustain you for the rest of your life. Why? You've got to eat every day, every day, every day, every day, every day. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here, right? And so these are the things that we got to embrace. My last podcast that was out this last week, it's a long one, it's an hour and a half, but my guest on the show was Clint Pease, who is the chief people officer of a $13 billion company. He said something that I think is worthy of our time today. He said, and this is in relation to conflict, he said, what you ignore becomes more, but what you address becomes less. What you ignore becomes more. It never goes away, does it? But what you address becomes less. So what if we make a commitment to growing in these 6 areas? Now, if you were to grade yourself, maybe you give yourself an A in one area, a C in another area. But when you do that kind of self-reflection, just doing that will grow you. God is not boring. He's creative. It's amazing what we can do. One thing that separates us from the animal kingdom is you can actually think about you. I'm surrounded by deer over here, and, deer they don't think about themselves. They don't think, next year what I'd like to get done. They don't think about the future. They're animals. But we have the ability, it's what's called a first creation and a second creation. And what I'm working with you on now is the first creation. In our mind's eye, we are creating a culture. In our mind's eye, we are creating a community. We're creating an enterprise. That's what we're doing in our mind. It's called the conception phase. If you think about the birthing cycle, there is the conception, the prenatal, the birth, the growth, and then hopefully the multiplication, right? And right now, as far as who we are in our development, when it comes to leadership, we're still in the conception phase. So it's first creation. But as we start practicing this, we're going to see it begin to show itself in different ways. We're going to be able to overcome the fear that keeps us from being grown adults and growing the organization in a way that we can bring in the kids. The kids can come, they can be safe with us, and we're going to grow them up. And that's the beauty of business. I'm not trying to give you a church meeting here, but I do remember something that Billy Graham said probably 20, 30 years ago. He said that he believed the next greatest spiritual revival was going to happen in the marketplace, in the business world, not behind stained glass windows. If business owners looked at business from a broader perspective and really began to see the opportunity to make a difference in people's lives. I thought that's a pretty powerful, powerful vision, powerful statement. All right, one last thing. I think we're onto something. I'm kind of camping on this communication piece because I think it's the big one. I think it's the big one that opens the floodgates to everything else. Have fun with figuring out how to identify what is winning and what is losing. Again, we're just playing with this. But if we were to create this thing called the West, it's a West Main sin. And again, you can call it miss. You could call it, that's what sin means anyway, is miss. That's what the actual word means. So I just, did a fun little list. When we point out that Victor brings back a plate of food that's cold, instead of saying it's a cold plate of food, we need some kind of a terminology that talks about all the sins and it calls them one thing so that we all know that these things that we're pointing out as leaders are all fit in the same category. They're not acceptable, right? But not acceptable is not a culture word, right? It's not a culture word. We need words that are unique to us. So just play the game with me. And he doesn't have to be a jerk. He brings the plate of food back to, whoever. He puts his hand on his shoulders and says, Johnny, this is a West Main sin. It's cold food. It's a West Main sin. And everyone's going to know we don't want a sin, right? We don't want a West Main sin. Ignoring a guest because, sometimes your hosts can be looking down at the seating chart and ignore somebody who walks in. No. The seating chart is never, remember we talked about this before, when little kids learn how to dribble the soccer ball, when little kids learn how to dribble the basketball, they have their head down because that's all their skill level is. But if you watch high school sports, if you watch college sports, if you watch pro sports, it's part of their body. They don't ever look down at the ball, right? So when these kids are new, that's how they're going to work. They don't have the capacity to realize that when somebody walks in the door, everything stops. Everything stops. Your grease pencil, whatever it is that you're using, your iPad, whatever it is, it stops. It's not important. What's important is that person that walks through. So you catch somebody looking down at their iPad when 2 or 3 people walk in. You don't do it then. You never embarrass anyone in front of anyone. You never do that. But, you put your arm around and say, hey, Sean, we had some customers walk in while you were doing this. And that's a West Main sin. It's a West Main sin. Oh, it's a sin. Oh, my God. I heard about the West Main sin. I don't want to be a West Main sin. Walking past something that's on the floor. Right? It's a West Main sin. It's a West Main sin. Someone that has an attitude, well, that's somebody else's job. Oh, that's a West Main sin, right? That's a West Main sin. So begin thinking about these examples where we can point them out, but they don't have to be negative. Do you follow what I'm saying? You can come up with a terminology and label everything that misses the mark as that. Let that become known that we don't do those things. It's a fumble. That would be one, right? You can call it a fumble. You could call it a miss. You could call it a sin. You could call it you can brainstorm those things together. That's a lot of information. I know you got a lot to do. Take care, everybody. If you're not part of the Lead Today community, let me invite you. Go to leadtodaycommunity.com. That's leadtodaycommunity.com and sign up for Monday Moments. It's a weekly email that will encourage your leadership. Again, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for telling a friend about the Today Counts show.